Get starched. Today we are going to be talking about optimal joint function, about joints, how to make them healthy, how to make sure that they are doing what they're supposed to. Now, in our last video, we really got into the weeds about what is a joint. How do we define a joint? And what we said was a joint is where we're going to have two bones. So we're going to have bone number one, we're going to have bone number two. And where two bones come together, there's going to be space between the two bones. And that space is actually going to be surrounded by a deep layer of connective tissue, which we call the capsule in my world. And that space between the two bones allows for what we call relative motion, or for two bones to move independently of each other. And that is what is critical when it comes to optimal joint function is space. Space allows for proper relative motion. And that space, or the capsule, defines the space, is so critical because it's micromotion, or the space at the capsule, that dictates macromotion in what we call the workspace. So we spent all last week talking about the space. What defines the space and all the above, how to get space when you don't have it. But we're going to talk about something a little bit different today. And what we're going to talk about today is variability. Why is variability so critical when it comes to maintaining joints? So if we think about the capsule, not as it's anatomically, presented, but if we kind of think about the capsule as this circle here, I want you to picture that this is a joint that has optimal function. You can think of this joint as your hip, right? So it has tons of space, and that means that those bones can have proper relative motion. So we have tons of space, which we'll get into in a second, of why space is going to, more space equals more variability. Okay, so because of life, because of sport, because of sitting down, because of getting injured, because of doing the same movement patterns over and over again, maybe you decided to be a baseball pitcher and you're throwing the same direction over and over again. If we don't use it, we lose it. So I want you to picture that this is your capsular space that you had in your hip. And because of your sport, because of injury, because of the movement patterns you do over and over again, because whatever, you sit down or you just don't train those ranges of motion, over time, if it's not trained or maintained, it's slowly lost. So I want you to picture that we start to lose space at the capsule. Okay? So now we don't have as much space, but we can still do stuff, but maybe we have more pain problems and plateaus than we thought before. And then maybe, a few years later, maybe 5 to 10 years later, we actually move less than we were. And now we have even less space. And now this guy's not too happy. Okay. So I want you to picture that this is representative of the space between two bones, which would be the space at the capsule, right? Which we defined in the last video. So we went from here, and now we don't have as much space. So now we're sad. We've got a sad hip, right? Let's just picture, just for sake of argument, this is your hip. And this is not what it actually looks like. Do the positions we load in and all the above and the patterns we repeat. So I want you to picture that we had a ton of space, and now we've lost space. And why is that so important when it comes to maintaining joint health? Well, something we've got to understand is what we call the second law of thermodynamics, okay? And what that basically says is stuff normally starts with order, right? So, and then over time, so right, this is time right here, stuff is going to head from order to disorder. And that's kind of a paraphrasing of the second law of thermodynamics. So we can think of this not just when it comes to joints, but when it comes to muscle, when it comes to anything in our body. If we don't train or maintain muscle mass, will slowly atrophy. Think about an astronaut in space is going to lose bone density. So we know that due to the second law of thermodynamics, everything is going to move from order to disorder, right? So what we don't want, right, is we don't want joints that are continually heading this direction, right? Because that means over time that we're going to lose optimal joint function. We're going to lose joint health. So we said variability is such a powerful and important and critical factor for maintaining health, right? So how do we define health? Well, first off, we know that we need to have enough space for proper relative motion. But secondly, we need variability, and that's due to the law of thermodynamics. So, right? So joint health we can think of as almost delaying entropy, right? So this is called entropy, right? Where stuff moves from order to disorder. And that sounds crazy, but I just want you to think without intervention, the human body and stuff breaks down over time. That's not, everyone gets that, right? Your joints aren't the same when you're 60 than when you were 16. So what is training? What are we attempting to do when we train, when we strength train, and when we do joint mobility work? Is I want you to picture that on this scale, right? So our joints, if we don't do anything, right? If we don't use it, we lose it. If we don't train to gain, we will maintain, or we will slowly lose over time. So with our goal with training is to ward off accommodation, right? Order to disorder, right? It's not just maintaining. So I want you to think, when we train, whether it's a joint, whether it's muscle, whether it's our cardiovascular aerobic system, what we are doing is we are doing training work, okay? So we are doing training work, and we're using energy. So work, right? We're using energy to do work. And then what we're doing is we're creating temporary order, right? To delay or right minimize the effects of entropy on a joint. So in a nutshell, it's not exactly like this. This is the magic of strength training, of training in general. And that's why people who are strength training and doing cardiovascular training and training their joints and stretching and all that stuff, that's why someone might be 38 years old and they actually have a biologically younger body than a person who is 5 years younger but has done nothing to maintain and train and gain. So it's almost like we're taking a mini time machine on the entropy scale, right? And we're temporarily getting a little bit more order out of disorder. And what that is doing is delaying that entropy, right? Eventually we're going to lose that battle, but we're trying to delay it as much as we can. And so we have to do training, we have to work, and we have to battle the fact that if we don't use it, we lose it. And if we don't train to gain, we will maintain. And if we don't maintain, we'll slowly lose over time. So we started off in the beginning saying that the first thing when it comes to having optimal joint function is space is the final frontier. And it's actually the first frontier too, meaning that if we don't have space, we got to acquire it. But then why is having space so important just besides the fact of having two bones and their ability to move together? Okay. Well, I think that it's easy to think of it like this, okay? So let's go ahead and wipe this out for a second. So why does more, so we said space is the goal, right? Because if we have more space, what's going to happen is we're actually going to see more variability. And we're going to learn today why variability is so crucial for delaying that entropy, okay? So let's think of it like this. I want you to picture that you are the manager of a giant sports complex of soccer fields, okay? Let's say we've got soccer field 1, 2, 3, you get it, 4, boom. So you have a giant sports complex. Sorry, no, it's taking a long time. And you have 12 soccer fields, right? That's a decent amount. So you have a lot of space. So I want you to picture 12 soccer fields that you're able to use the space to do whatever you want, right? You could play soccer, you could play flag football, you have all this space available to you. So if you were the manager of a soccer field or a sports complex and you had 12 full-size soccer fields, the first thing that space allows you to do is it gives you more options. And more options is, in a nutshell, variability, right? So when I think of more options, I could tell people, well, so let's say I wanted to have one soccer game here, I wanted to have one soccer game here, and one soccer game here. Boom. I could do it like that. I could say, I don't want to touch these fields at all. I'm just going to have all the games played on these fields. There's lots of ways of doing business. So more options, more variability. So if I had 12 soccer fields, I'd have a lot more options when it comes to how I would allow people to use the space. Now I want you to think, if I was in charge of a sports complex and I only had 2, so I want you to picture now I've only got these 2 soccer fields. So I don't have as much space. Well, I don't have many options about how to use that space. I've either got to go here, I've got to go here, or I've got to be there at both at the same time, or nothing. So less space equals less variability, right? So that is super important to understand, because we said that, number one, when it comes to 2 bones and having proper relative motion, if there's not enough space, we won't get proper relative motion. But beyond the fact of having that joint independence and the ability to move one bone relative to the other, we have to understand that variability is going to be super important. So if you have space, you have more options. If you don't have space, you have less options. So now what I want you to think is, now let's think about this in terms of kind of more entropy and breakdown. So we said that in a nutshell, training is trying to delay that breakdown, or that going from order to disorder, right? We're trying to delay that joint degradation over time. So let me go back to my example, and we've got 12 soccer fields. Boom. Okay, now here's what I want you to picture. I want you to picture that you've got pristine soccer fields, and they've all got beautiful green grass, and you're in charge, right? You've got a maintenance team that is going to be responsible for making sure the grass is well kept, the lines are painted, that when all the people come in and play a game, that they cut the grass, they mow it, they fix it. So now I want you to picture that if I have all this grass, and I want you to picture, let's say we have like 6 soccer games going. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Cool. So if I had 6 soccer games and I had 12 fields, people could play games on this. We could have 1 game on each field. And then after the game was done, the maintenance crews would be able to take care of those spaces, and we should be fine. And especially I want you to think we played 6 games here, and then all of a sudden the next day we played games on these fields. And then by the time we got back to the first field, it had maybe been a couple days, and my maintenance crew had time to water the turf, maintain it, maybe fix any potholes was going on, because they've had time to repair that field. Now, I want you to think about a little bit different. So I want you to picture that you have less options. So now we have those 2 fields again, but we need to have 6 games played. Now I want you to picture that you play 2 games at the same time, and then 2 games right after that, and then 2 games right after that. What would all these other fields be? They would be pristine. Now, 3 games in a row would start to chew up those fields even more, because you're kind of smashing into the same turf. You're cutting it up, you're picking it up, and all that stuff. So what I want you to think is you're using those same lines of field. You're running on the same areas. And obviously, if you have more games in a row, that's more volume, that's more time spent on those fields. And especially, I want you to think if those games were played at higher intensity. So let's say you had professional soccer players versus like young kids. If you had young kids playing on those fields, they're not running super fast. They're not doing anything crazy. They're not cutting at a super high speeds. So if you had, youth athletes, they might not tear up the field as much as if you had collegiate soccer players who are going all out. So if this is my only option, so if I don't have much space, I have decreased variability. If I've decreased variability, I have less options of muscle tissue to load or connective tissue to train and gain. So now here's what I want you to think. I'm going to start to use these fields, and especially if I start doing stuff at high intensity, it's going to start to speed up and chew up those fields. Now, that's no problem because the human body is incredibly adaptive, and when we train stuff, it does get better, stronger, faster. But our body has limited adaptability, so it has limited ability to adapt, and has limited recovery resources, meaning we can only adapt so quickly with so much inputs, and at the same time, there's something called cellular senescence. What cellular senescence is that basically tissue can only adapt to a finite level. Right? At a certain point, you can't get any more adaptability out of the same line of tissue. This is why people know that you have to mix it up in the gym, that after so long that if you did the same weights with the same sets and reps 6 months in a row, eventually you'd have to change something to get any adaptations. So now I want you to think, in this scenario, if you were trying to increase the longevity of the turf field, so if you were in charge of this sports complex, which would be an easier option for maintaining? Would you rather have 12 fields where you would have many options? So let's say you have the first field and it's been getting used a ton. Let's say these first 2 fields have been getting beat up, and no matter how much you have your maintenance crews work on them, they're still getting beat up pretty bad. Well, if you have more fields or more space, you have more variability, which equals more options, right? More options equals more tissue to load. And more tissue equals I can train more stuff, which means I can delay entropy more, which is the breakdown of tissue. So if I had 12 fields, if this stuff was starting to get torn up and all the grass was starting to die out, I could say, whoa, I can now use this field, this field, this field, this field. But now here's what I want you to think. I want you to think about the athlete, the person who does not have much space. So their body has limited options. So they're going to have to use the limited choices when it comes to what tissue they train and use. Now you can see how if they're trying to do a ton of work, so picture if I had 20 games and I only had 2 fields to play it on, those fields are going to get beat up a lot quicker than if the work was getting spread out to all these fields, right? You can easily see that. So what that means in a nutshell is this would accelerate the degradation of these fields even if I was doing my best to maintain it. So most likely over time, those fields would slowly, over a long period of time, go from more orderly to disordered. So you'd start to see grass where it wouldn't grow in certain areas, ruts, start to get really choppy on the field. Maybe the grass doesn't grow in as much. Maybe there's crabgrass. Maybe there's weeds. Now you get the point. Even if I was trying to maintain that. Now remember, this is not to say that the body, that using your joints is a bad thing. It's not that using your joints, so a lot of people will be like, oh, you don't want to use your joints too much, they'll wear out. And there's a little bit of truth in there, but a lot of kind of some misconception about joints. So they are right that if you don't have much variability because of a decreased lack of space at the capsule or the joint level, then you won't have as many options, you won't have as much tissue to train, and you're going to have to use whatever tissue you have available to you. So if you're not recovering properly, if you're doing too much volume, so if I'm not maintaining these fields, or I'm trying to play too many games too quickly, so I want you to picture if I had 20 games on a Monday night, if I had 7 days before the next soccer tournament, I'd probably be able to help these fields get back in a little bit more order. But if I have 20 games on a Monday and then 20 games on Tuesday, there's no opportunity for me to repair those fields. There's not enough recoverability of those tissues. So if I have that, then what we're going to see is if we go back to the original example, an accelerate breakdown, and this is where we start to see joints wear down, break down, and get kind of hashtag shittier, right? So if I go back here, so if I have a joint capsule that has a bunch of space, right? When I do something like a squat, when I do movements, I can explore all this space. I can load these tissues. 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 I can load this, right? But now, if we take that same hip capsule, and because over time you have not maintained the joint, and over time you have not treated the capsule as a trainable thing. So now let's say this is the space you have available. So this stuff you don't have access to, so you can't move in this area anymore. So you've lost this relative motion, so you don't have access to all this stuff out here. That means that your movement options, so now when you squat, instead of exploring all that space, you have less options, less variability because you have less space. Now, let's say when you squat, every time you squat and you go from flexion to extension, this is your movement pattern, and you're just going to smash into these tissues, and you're going to, just like a soccer player in that previous example, you're going to use those soccer fields right there. And if you allow for enough recoverability and you program it right, you're going to be able to keep up with maintenance. But most people aren't recovering well, and they're doing too much volume, and they're smashing into these tissues. So what's going to happen is we're going to see an accelerated degradation of these areas. And then the problem is, if I squat and I just keep squatting the same way over and over time, we're going to see degradation of that, and then we're generally going to happen to see pain, tightness. We're going to see compensation, right? Because when this happens at the capsule, it's going to show up. So micromotion at the capsule is going to dictate macromotion. So what happens is then you're going to have a trainer say, okay, when you're squatting, I want you to make sure your knees are pushed out. And then he's going to say, or she's going to say, I don't want you squatting over here. So now they've removed this area of the capsule from being trained when you squat. And they say, oh, I want you to not round your back at all, so we're going to remove this area of your hip capsule. And now all of a sudden, you're training a very small and finite line of tissue in area of the joint capsule. And then over time, that which is not trained and gained will be maintained, and that which is not maintained will be lost. So then over time, you no longer have access to this. You no longer have access to this. This stuff is starting to break down at a quicker level. And then we wonder why our joints are not healthy, right? Now, here's the great news. This is trainable. So we can go from a state where we don't have much space and don't have much variability, and we can gain it back. But just like if you couldn't do the splits, you can't just relax your way to the splits. You can't get a massage and then you're going to be in the splits in 6 weeks. You have to actually do training work to increase the space. And then once we have the space, we need to explore it so that we are getting that good variability. And that variability means that we're loading more tissues. And who's going to adapt more? And when I say adapt, you can think of adapt as get stronger, faster, better, right? So if I have lifter A and lifter B, okay, let's put that in. Who's going to be able to adapt more? And this is obviously, so if I've got lifter A, and this is their hip capsule, and I've got lifter B, and this is their hip capsule, okay? Well, here's what we have to understand is lifter A, let's say, has 5 degrees of hip rotation, okay? So let's say it's hip internal rotation. Say lifter B has 25 degrees. Cool. So we know that lifter B has more space, so they have more availability, more options, more tissue. So if you think about it, let's say lifter A, we're going to make this just really easy math-wise. Lifter A is 5 degrees, so they have access when they move their hip or do exercises with their hip to, let's say, 5 million muscle fibers, even though we know it would be way more, okay? Cool. So they have 5 million muscle fibers or lines of tissue to get stronger, faster, better, to adapt. So this is the potential. So that's their potential to adapt. Stuff to train that you can get stronger, faster, better, okay? Now, all of a sudden, we have lifter B with 25, so I want you to now think they have access to 25 million. Obviously, this is a super simple example, but simple is going to make it easier to understand. So if you had 2 lifters, and after 5, let's say we train lifter A and B for 5 years, and we don't do anything specifically to address lifter A's deficit, and lifter B, same thing. So let's just say we just maintained the space. So let's say we didn't even get worse. And we know most people over time get worse because they don't use their end ranges of motion, so they slowly lose them. So let's say they maintain, they don't even regress. I want you to think after 5 years, so if we train these two for 5 years, where's lifter B at? Way higher than lifter A, because lifter A went here and they ran out of tissue to train, so they're in Plateauville because they adapted all those tissues as much as they can. I want you to think lifter B, it's going to take way longer to reach a plateau because they have so much more tissue available to train, right? So not only is it potential, but in terms of gains, right, we're going to see that lifter A is going to tap out. Now, if you think about it, this actually is probably going to get worse over time because, like I said, when we have this, we're going to start to see pain show up if we start to damage tissues, right, and stuff like that. So now we're seeing why space and variability not only slow down the degradation of joint breakdown, but also give us the potential to get stronger, faster, better than the person who has access to less space. So, right, if we go back to the beginning, bone 1, and then we've got bone 2, and we have space, right? And then we've got the capsule that defines the space, which is the connective tissue. So, optimal joint function says we need space, right, for the bones to move. But now you know we don't just need bones to move, we need space so the nervous system has lots of variability or options to choose how it goes about doing a squat or a lunge or a leg exercise. More tissues equals more stuff to train. Whoever is training more stuff over a longer period of time will be stronger, faster, better. Who's ever training less tissue over a longer period of time will start to run into accommodation or entropy. Entropy in accommodation is Plateauville, which eventually leads to degradation and breakdownville, which is where someone is like, oh my gosh, my knees now that I'm 40 just feel like terrible. Or how many people talk about, oh, once I hit 35, my back just started hurting all the time. Well, it's number one is because over time, like I said, they've been losing space because if they're not training at those end ranges or purposefully, if this is not a training objective, so if you don't go into the gym and say, do I have enough space for my joints? Number one, if that's not your outcome measure, so if you don't have joints or optimal joint function as an outcome measure or a goal, you're not going to do it or you're not going to know it's improving, right? So this actually has to be something that you attempt to train in the gym. But what most people do is most people go and just do an exercise that makes them feel looser. So a lot of people don't check to see or don't even care, like I said, people don't care about a joint unless it's hurting generally, right? This is the flaw of human beings. We don't start working on something until it's absolutely broken or damaged into oblivion. So what we're going to see is that we can actually accelerate that decrease in space. So we as trainers and strength coaches can actually make this worse on people. So now here's what I want you to think. If my entire training program is movement patterns, and I'm talking like set movement patterns where someone says, okay, here's your hips available space to squat with, and now you're going to barbell squat with your toes out at 30 degrees. You're going to push your knees out, and the squat has to look like this. So the squat can't look like this because that's wrong according to trainer. And the squat can't look like this because that's wrong according to Instagram. It has a red check mark next to it. The second we say this is a movement pattern, you need to make this exercise look like this. You are constraining the movement to make it a pattern. And once you do that, you have basically closed off various parts of the capsule, which is not a problem for, like a couple workouts, a couple weeks. But if over 10 years, I stop using training or exploring this space, I will lose it. That is just the law. Your body doesn't just hold on to all this space just because that would be really nice, right? So what we're going to see is when people say, okay, the way to make your legs stronger is that you barbell squat with your legs your feet at 30 degrees, your knees out, your chest up, and that is, if you don't do that, you're squatting wrong. See, they're thinking about just recreating patterns. They're not thinking about joints or making the system more adaptable, or how do I improve, right, the ability of my system to adapt. So if we tell people, like, the only way you are allowed to squat is this, then all of a sudden we've said, if you do anything out here, that's wrong, this is right. And people will say, well, if I'm doing all this stuff out here, that's how I'm going to get injured. It's like, that's not how injury works, right? Injury simply isn't, just because I went to this area of my end range that I'm going to blow up into a million pieces. In fact, actually, this is where we're weakest. So if you are only strong as your weakest link, wouldn't it be wise in the gym to be able to train where you are weak to improve it? If your goal of training is to bulletproof you, to prevent injuries, then you should be training when you're weak, not just recreating movement patterns and saying, oh, if you train this movement pattern, you're going to have joints that are functioning better and you're preventing injuries. But if you actually think about it, if I literally only train set movement patterns and I start constraining movement and saying this is wrong, right, and I start closing off, losing space, the number one thing we see with overuse injuries is a decrease of variability at the joint. So if you have very limited variability at your joint, your chances of an overuse injury or a wear and tear or I keep tweaking my shoulder or my right knee just sucks. Every time I run, my right knee hurts. You are actually accelerating this process, right? So when you artificially get rid of variability over a long period of time or set period of time, you are accelerating the breakdown of joints. And that's why, and most people don't realize that. And it's not to say that barbell squat's bad. It's not. Barbell squats are awesome. But a barbell squat requires a hip. A hip does not require a barbell squat. And what I mean by that is people's goals are exercises. Now, if it's required of your sport or it's desired, do it. So if you have to do a deadlift because it's required of your sport, do it. If it's desired because you want to do a 3 times bodyweight deadlift, awesome. But the second you have a pattern exercise or a movement pattern, you are now saying, I am decreasing variability. And if your only goal is to get your squat from 200 to 400, and that's your measurement and outcome measure in your feedback loop, you might not realize that as your squat went from 200 to 400, your hip went from level 100 to level 72. So your squat went up, but your hip went down. And over time, what you're doing is you're accelerating the breakdown of that joint. Or what we're going to see is you will compensate, because if we start to lose space, we start to lose relative motion. And if we lose relative motion, we'll compensate until we can't. And we'll keep doing that until something breaks or something hurts. And then when something hurts and breaks, we generally move less, not more. And then it's this vicious cycle of continually losing space and variability. Now, this is not all doom and gloom, and this is not a message of fear, and this is not a message saying, oh my gosh, your joints are breaking down and entropy is the boogeyman. But it is true. Most people have to acknowledge that if you're not training to gain when it comes to your joints, you will maintain. And we saw the problem with maintaining. If for the next 5 years you maintain your joint space, but you increase all your lifts, you are eventually going to run out of tissues to train and you will plateau, or those tissues that have adapted can only take so much and then they're just going to blow up, right? Because it's almost like that soccer field where you can only use it so many times before the grass would just die, because there's no ability for that grass to regrow and for maintenance to do its job. So joints are trainable. They are important. And every lift you ever do requires a joint, but not every joint requires a certain lift. I can get my hip stronger, faster, better without a squat, but I can't get my squat better without a hip. And most people are thinking about things in the inverse, and it's not wrong, but it's not necessarily right. So when you go into the gym, I encourage you, instead of thinking, how do I get my squat heavier? If that's your goal, okay, that's fine. If it's required, so if you have to do a squat, for maybe you're in the police or maybe you're in the military and you have to do a squat for a fitness test, okay. But I want to encourage you to now think about it in the opposite. Instead of thinking, how do I go into the gym and make my squat more? I want you to go into the gym and say, how do I make my hip more so that my squat has the ability to more? That sounds confusing, but if you think about it, if the stuff that makes up the lift is more, then the lift has to be more if you practice the lift. But I've seen plenty of people get their lift heavier and their joints are more in pain than they were. They have less range of motion. And if you think about it, in the long run, that's actually going to lead to an accelerated breakdown of that joint. And we know there's plenty of people that get hip surgeries or hip replacements, knee replacements, shoulder surgeries, labrum surgeries. And one of the reasons that a lot of people run into issues at their joint is because of the lack of variability. And that all comes down to space. And once again, if we don't have space, we need to gain space. And if you have space, you need to train, explore, and use those ranges of motion. But unfortunately, because in strength and conditioning, we've created this world of perfect movement patterns where we've eliminated a lot of the workspace and the capsular space from most strength and conditioning exercises. So what we've done is we've actually accelerated the breakdown with a lot of traditional strength training. But if you're smart and intelligent, you can use traditional strength training and full range of motion strength training to actually work on this problem. But most people are more concerned about going to failure, putting more weight on the bar. And most people don't go into the gym and say, I'm going to use my barbell squat today to train my hip capsule. They say, I'm going to squat because I want to squat. And that's totally fine. But I want you to understand that there's layers to this. And there's nothing to be lost from training and making your joint better. Like, think of anyone over the age of 50. Do you think anyone over the age of 50 or 40 or even 30 would say, wow, I really regret over the last 3 years improving the function of my joints? No one that I know, but yet I have DMs every day and I have hundreds of messages, thousands every year, of people begging for help with their ankle, their knee, their hip, their back, their shoulder, their elbow, their neck, their shoulder, their elbow, their neck, their hip, their back, their knees. And it's kind of funny how people rarely ever message me about the lift. Some people do. Like, sometimes I'll get a message saying, hey, Taylor, I'm trying to get my weighted pull-up heavier. I'm stuck at 70 pounds. But I would say that 95% of every message I get, and I get tons of messages, and I'm a very small account compared to some other accounts. all the messages are, my joints are breaking down, my joints hurt, my joints suck, my joints, I'm tight, I'm painful, I'm tight. When I squat, my back hurts, this, that. And notice how there's a common theme where I bet you if I asked all these people, they're training the lifts and they're trying to execute a movement pattern, but they're not trying to improve the joint by getting more space and then using that variability to load more of the capsular space or to explore more of it. Okay, barbell squats are not bad. Mobility work is not good. There's no good or bad. There is just training, right? And training is something we all need to do if we're going to delay and fight entropy. But now we know that variability is one of the biggest weapons in our tool belt when it comes to delaying entropy and breakdown and accelerated degradation of those joints, okay? So there is a tiny little bit of truth when people say, oh, that's going to, it's going to wear and tear your joints. It's like, well, no, there's a little bit of truth in that, but there's a lot of lie in that, because if you do give your body variability and space, your body and your joints will explore it. So that's a lot. And for a lot of you, I just want you to think of the simple lesson, okay? Space allows two bones to move, and then it allows us to load and explore more tissues, which means we can train and adapt over a longer period of time, and we can train and adapt more stuff over a longer period of time. If more stuff over a longer period of time is adapting, you're getting stronger, faster, better. If over time, less stuff is adapting over a long period of time, stuff is probably breaking down, you're probably getting injured, you're probably getting tighter, and your joints are probably sucking more. And then we try to fix the output instead of the input, so the output might be squat. So people say, oh, well, just get your, we need to get you stronger because, your glutes weak. Very rarely will someone say, hey, I think you don't have space in your hip capsule. We need to get that back because we've lost it about 7 years ago, and you haven't had much variability, and you haven't had many tissues to load and explore, okay? So this is how we get starched, and this is just another lesson when it comes to improving optimal joint function.